So today I will be presenting my research and findings for my undergraduate research project on female representation in true crime and why accurate representation in regards to power and agency matters. So for my intro, the purpose of my research is to attempt to understand how women are portrayed in the true crime genre, as women are the predominant viewers of the genre, making up approximately 85% of viewership, reportedly have the highest reported fear of crime. To really explain what I'm talking about, let me just ask you this one question. So, out of the two main genders, which do you believe experiences a higher rate of crime and victimization? If you said women, you would actually be incorrect. Now, since women are not the primary victims of murder and assault in real life, along with the media becoming an increasingly important tool for education, it is then that the purpose of my research is to determine how women are portrayed in the media to understand why this victim role is so apparent for women if we clearly aren't the ones who are the predominant holders of it. I chose this genre as it already deals with crime in the media, and understanding its discursive narratives will help me to further my findings. Some background on my topic: the true crime genre can be described as a nonfiction, literary, film, and podcasting genre where the author or producer examines details of an actual crime. Some of the most common crimes depicted are ones such as assault, murder, and kidnapping. This genre has been rising in popularity recently as streaming services such as Netflix and Spotify have been adding more content to its repertoire on what seems like a daily basis. My question then is, how are women represented within the true crime genre, specifically in regards to power and agency, and why is it so important that we get these representations right? While I was conducting my literature review, I found that the true crime genre is by no means a new genre. In fact, it's been thriving since 1550 when it was first created in England, and at the time there was no formal police force, so the citizenry really had to take matters of safety into their own hands. And because of the introduction of the printing press, citizens were able to create what are known as crime pamphlets to spread the word on crimes in their community. The typically depicted crimes being ones such as gruesome murders, women's criminal activities, and particularly bloody assaults, along with an illustration for an added appeal. This is where we see a prominent fear of crime, as the typical tones used were of sensation, propaganda, and morality. Then comes murder ballads, or narrative verses recounting the hostile deeds of the most notorious criminals in England at the time, and were dispersed throughout Europe, emerging in the early 1600s. Ballads are thought to represent early attempts to unearth social and psychological causes of crime, along with introducing the idea that viewers enjoy this genre because of the intrigue around the victim, combined with the depravity of the killer. After ballads, there were crime essays, where we begin to see crime become a point of scientific and social inquiry. Famous writers such as Edgar Allan Poe became fascinated by murder, brutality, and the randomness of crime. Now, this is really where we begin to see our fascination with crime being created, becoming more and more popular in the media at the time, along with the dynamic narratives that were introduced, where crimes were now being depicted from the point of the killer, the victim, and its effects on the greater community. After that, in the mid-1800s, Francois, I do not know how to pronounce his last name, was a criminal-turned-investigator who wrote essays on crimes such as his memoirs. His investigatory methods and personal knowledge of criminal activity made him incredibly intriguing, and it is because of his impact on literature that we currently have the role of an investigator. And then in 1965, this is where we really begin to get modern American true crime. Truman Capote released his book In Cold Blood. His work issued in the theme that crime opens up our unspoken fears of society and how you will never truly know someone like you think you do. Here we also get the idea of personalizing the victim and the killer, which basically means like getting to know who they were as a person before the crime was committed, their hopes, fears, dreams, etc. And because of this personalization, we get this linear analysis of crime, or a cause and effect relationship. So moving on to true crime television, the format emerged in the 80s with shows such as America's Most Wanted, where we can see a hybrid of news programming being superimposed on an entertainment format, seemingly to produce a new reality where your real and imagined fears of crime were now seemingly true. After that, we have streamable true crime and podcasting, which seemingly grew up together. With being so easily accessible, true crime became the perfect breeding ground for binge watching. Both forms have now become tailored towards binge watching, with added cinematic tools such as cliffhangers, plot twists, and mystery to keep viewers wanting more and to keep them intrigued. Along with binge watching, it offers a more intimate and more personalized viewing experience, and because of the consistent viewing experience, it allows you to dive deeper and deeper into the story, causing you to be more affected by it. So these cinematic tools really help to keep viewers engaged in a manner that no other format really has been able to do before. Now, moving on to female representation in true crime, many cases are centered around the death or routine victimization of a woman. If women are not predominant victims of murder and assault in real life, then why are we being allowed to feel like victims in society? This is where we begin to see issues of power and agency as the element of power becomes killer over victim, and with the gendered stereotypes that I'm going to be discussing a little bit further in a moment, the majority of these cases involve a man killing a woman, and this is a trend that just keeps reoccurring within the true crime genre. Along with this power dynamic of killer over victim, man over woman, with the only agency that women ever receive are of that as a victim. On top of this toxic power dynamic, all of the cases that I was able to find from both programs that I viewed were exclusively centered around either the death or kidnapping of a young woman. Within the true crime genre, gendered stereotypes are often furthered. One explanation to this routine narrative is that women are typically depicted in society as demure, fragile, and vulnerable, causing them to be a perpetual victim. These stereotypes are furthered through the use of women as only a mother, a daughter, an assistant, or a friend, as there is usually a nurturing and protective air to their character. Gender stereotypes almost become a balance that need to be fulfilled in society. So if women are taking on this role of daughter, mother, friend, assistant, etc., then men will take on the opposite. Women then are also often omitted from accurate narratives within the true crime genre, and one example that I was able to come across within the Ted Bundy tapes, there was a female officer named Kathleen McChesney who was involved in the investigation since day one, but was only utilized in the series for roughly 10 minutes when the series is 5 hours long, allowing viewers to feel that her role in the case wasn't as important as a man's role. So crime becomes viewed as an unusual occurrence in true crime so that viewers don't feel like they have to face the burden of dealing with such a big issue, that issue being that crimes against women are very much real and are a problem that needs to be fixed. One example of this popping up within the genre is the idea of Ted Bundy's celebrification. So while the delivery of his crimes was definitely unique, the crimes themselves were not. Many considered him to be an evil genius when in actuality he was just committing heinous crimes regularly enough and no one was able to catch him that he was in turn given the same role as a celebrity in the media. This view encourages viewers that crime does have a direct cause and effect relationship where the victims are usually the ones to be blamed. All of these, along with an overrepresentation of women in crime media, lead to an imagined fear of crime and victimization, stripping us of any power or agency that we once had. This can be seen in women's fear of walking home alone at night. First, I will be utilizing the male gaze theory from feminist theorist Laura Mulvey. Up next, there's the theory that I will be using, which is feminist theory. Following is my methods of a textual analysis. One of the ideologies I'm going to be focusing on is patriarchal ideals. And lastly, I will be finishing up my methods with a comparative analysis of Conversations with a Killer, the Ted Bundy tapes, along with the Crime Junkie podcast, a couple episodes from the Crime Junkie podcast that can be found on Spotify. Laura Mulvey's theory on the male gaze helps me to showcase how women are routinely cast as an ideal victim, along with patriarchal ideologies in mind. Hegemony basically implies that what is consented to by the subordinate groups is a negotiated version of the ruling group's ideologies, in this case men as the ruling class, women as the subordinates, with the patriarchy as the ideology. Meaning that typical stereotypes such as strong and manly, beautiful and fragile women are furthered because that is what patriarchal ideologies will allow. Since only those narratives are allowed, the male gaze is furthered through the idea of there being women as an ideal victim, with men being the killers. An example of this can be seen in the Ted Bundy tapes by reporters mentioning how Bundy considered him, and this is a direct quote, Bundy considered himself to be a hunter who liked to take big game, as it furthers his masculinity along with women as victims. Following that exact quote, there is B-roll of a map of the Pacific Northwest with pinpoints for each one of his victims where they were all found in that geographic location. Following is my methods. I conducted a comparative analysis of the Ted Bundy tapes along with a handful of episodes from the Crime Junkie podcast, as they are both quite popular within the genre and will help me to highlight some of these misrepresentations and ideologies. So some comparisons that I found. Some points of harmful misrepresentation that I noticed were how they centered their cases around females, this died because she was alone narrative, and the commodification of women's bodies. Starting with centering their cases around females. All of the cases that I were able to find were centered on the death of a woman. This heightens the idea to viewers that women are only victims, as the case the cases of men who, remember, are murdered at higher rates, not much higher rates, but higher rates than women, are rarely ever showcased. Next up is the died because she was alone narrative. This one was more predominant in the Ted Bundy tapes, but this directly correlates to women's inherent fear of crime and victimization in society, as all of the murders or assaults happened for the brief moment that women were left alone, which makes us feel that we will never truly be able to be safe in society. Lastly was the commodification of women's bodies. So commodification, for those who may not know, is basically taking something and turning it into a product. The use of broken women at the center of these cases makes them into a product that can be used to heighten the depravity of the case, to further employ fear as an appeal, along with the cinematic techniques that follow it in suit. One example that I was able to find was within the Ted Bundy tapes through the use of explicit details. So the head sheriff starts discussing the sorority murders within his case and Bundy's use of brutalization specifically. And there's a 5-second long clip of one of the victims contorted, bloodied, and with her face shoved into her pillow. While I understand that these were aspects of the case and were somewhat necessary to discuss, how necessary was it to actually show the victim in such a vulnerable and broken state? On the contrast, some things that differed a little bit, or any differences that I found, were levels of sexualization, levels of manufactured fear, along with levels of routine omission. So in terms of sexualization, the Ted Bundy tapes definitely utilized sexualization more than the Crime Junkie podcast, as his crimes did have a sexual nature to them. There were copious amounts of B-roll used, objectifying women as objects to be used and abused in these cases, which only furthers the idea that women are commodified objects to be used. Up next are levels of manufactured fear. So the Crime Junkie podcast was able to create a fear appeal as well, but one that didn't evoke such a visceral reaction to the Ted Bundy tapes. Rather, the producers would emphasize certain words and be very strategic and intentional with their phrasing to evoke a natural and mild feeling of fear that managed to keep viewers wanting more. For example, one quote that I was able to pull from an episode was, "The boy goes inside only to stumble upon a nightmare, because there, inside, is Eli, shot to death." With the Ted Bundy tapes, there are constant clips of his eyes almost staring into your soul, and it makes you almost so uncomfortable that you have to stop watching. But compared to the last sentence that I just read out, you almost feel like you want to keep watching more because you want to know, like, how that person died, what happened. Like, you're actually invested in the case because they managed to phrase it in such a way that you actually want more versus genuinely being scared while watching. Lastly, we have the routine omission, where women in the Ted Bundy tapes were sparingly mentioned by name. The majority of times victims were brought up, it was either by showing their missing flyer, crime scene photos of them, and to be completely honest, I had to keep reminding myself of their names and who they actually were outside of their death and their case very often, as they were only mentioned so briefly. On the contrary, since the Crime Junkie podcast actually utilizes an investigatory approach to their content, the victims were named often, one victim having her name used approximately 30 times in a 17-minute long episode, compared to the maybe, and I do mean maybe, 10 times that a single victim was named throughout the 5-hour-long documentary series. Up next are my findings. So some of them I kind of stated already. Some themes that I was able to uncover were the idea of women as ideal victims, that by furthering gendered stereotypes in genres such as true crime and media, men are then forced to take on a strong dominant role with women left to take on the more fragile and vulnerable role, ending up as the victim in every crime, which tends to be showcased through many forms of true crime that utilize women as the victim. Followed by broken bodies being considered a hot commodity, as it is the broken bodies of women that help to highlight the depravity of these killers, leading to a more intriguing and potentially successful product of content. Followed by manufactured fear as an added appeal, where fear is used to emphasize and anchor in points of intrigue, along with furthering cinematic techniques such as cliffhangers, plot twists, mystery, and more. So for my conclusion, you may still be thinking, why does accurate representation of women in regards to power and agency actually matter? Because the current narrative that we have in regards to power and agency is currently as a product and as a victim. If we are ever to gain social equality, then we need to begin to confront the harmful narratives that I stated in my findings. Media is a powerful tool for education, and omitting or misrepresenting entire groups can correlate to how they are actually treated in real life. And to be quite frank, women are tired of being scared to leave their homes. So what could be done going forward? So these narratives will always be in play to create some form of a balance, but what we can do as viewers is to think more critically on what we watch going forward and to be mindful of these toxic narratives and to try and circumvent them or fully improve them. So some limitations that I faced. I didn't have the opportunity to discuss things like men's issues in regards to feminism, intersectionality and feminism in Fear of Crime, or differences of these topics in regards to race, sexuality, and other genders appropriately, as there is some research done on that topic, but due to time constraints, I didn't have the opportunity to fully expand on them. And then lastly, how I plan to continue. I plan to take what I have uncovered in my research as well as what I have learned from this course to further my research in a more expansive manner in the future. Lastly, I would be somewhat remiss if I spent these past 15 minutes or so discussing how women have become products and how they are vitally important to these cases and not have the decency to at least mention their names. So on this last slide, I've listed all of the names of Ted Bundy's known victims, along with the victims that were mentioned in the episodes of the Crime Junkie podcast, in order to properly highlight their experiences, which may have not gotten the opportunity to before. And that's it for my findings and research, and I just wanted to say thank you for listening to me state my findings, and as I mentioned before, I hope to further these in the future. So thank you for listening.